From MTN, the Montana Television Network, this is Face the State.
Good morning and welcome to a special edition of Face the State on the Montana Television Network. I'm Mike Dennison, MTN's Chief Political Reporter. As you probably know, the 2019 Montana Legislature is set to convene starting January 7th in Helena. Last week, we gave you a brief preview of the issues facing Governor Bullock and the Republican majorities at the legislature. Today, in our 30-minute show, we dive a bit deeper on the 2019 session. We'll hear more from the governor, the Attorney General, and top legislative leaders about what they're expecting and hoping for in the coming 4 months at the Capitol. We start with Medicaid expansion, the $600 million a year program that provides government-funded health care to nearly 100,000 low-income adults in Montana. It's set to expire in June, and lawmakers must decide whether and how to extend it. The federal government pays 90% of the cost of this program, but the state must pay the remaining 10%, and within certain limits can decide how to administer it. Governor Steve Bullock, a Democrat and a big supporter of Medicaid expansion, is asking the Republican-controlled legislature to extend the program in its current form. But GOP leaders say they want to take a closer look. The revenue looks pretty good and could actually even pay for Medicaid expansion without any tax increases, and I don't know how it fits into the budget, but I looked at that and thought, well, you guys can just come in here, approve the budget, approve Medicaid expansion, and go home. Is it going to be that easy?
No. It's never that easy. Medicaid expansion certainly is going to get a lot of attention in this session, there's no doubt about it. That program needs to be more affordable for the taxpayers. I believe it needs to have a lot more sideboards put on it. I think there's a lot of consensus within Republican circles that that's going to be the case. Means test, asset tests, work requirements, and I mean more meaningful work requirements. When you have an economy where you have less than 4% unemployment, people can find jobs. They're readily available. Quite possibly, there could be a drug test put into it, and not necessarily to be punitive, but you test positive for drugs, you're going to get put into some sort of drug rehabilitation program, which will hopefully benefit the person in the long run and will benefit the taxpayers in the long run too. So it's not going to look like, I think, what in its current form, but it's going to get a lot of attention in this session, no doubt about it.
Republican leaders also note that in November, voters rejected Initiative 185, which would have extended Medicaid expansion and raised tobacco taxes by $2 on a pack of cigarettes to help pay for the state's share of the program cost.
But if you look at his budget, he's proposing a $1.50 per pack increase on cigarettes and continuing Medicaid expansion as is. Well, that initiative failed, and I think that sent a message to the legislature that we need to look at Medicaid expansion, see if we can do some reforms on it, and get it through the legislation with minimal tax increases and help those individuals who need it across the state.
That sounds to me like you're kind of assuming that Medicaid expansion will be extended in some form, but not just as is.
I believe we'll take a real hard look at how we can extend Medicaid in Montana, but not in its current form.
Governor Bullock says there should be no real argument against extending the program, which he maintains has benefited the state in many ways.
Seen great successes, both with the number of people covered, also dropping our uninsured rate from 20% to 7%, the $300 million of new personal income that's been brought into our state, and we haven't lost one rural hospital. The program that we passed is actually a model. Other states have adopted it. So certainly when we got the HELP Act through, I made some concessions, always willing to talk to legislators about the best path forward. But that doesn't mean getting health care that businesses and their employees rely on. 70% of those folks actually on Medicaid are working today. 8 out of 10 are in a working family. And they're working in every county in our state. So I think that while there are more people that were covered than we expected, that also shows the need for health care. And this has been a real successful program. Actually, Montana's led the nation when it comes to increased workforce participation because how we brought Democrats and Republicans together. What we're doing is providing opportunities for businesses that aren't paying enough to Montanans to get their own health care So effectively, it's not like we're subsidizing 100,000 Montanans. We're subsidizing businesses that ought to be paying more so that folks can have health care.
You've also said before that things like work requirements and other things like that may actually cost more to administer than they're worth.
And again, I'll work with Democrats and Republicans for the best system for Montana. And if we can improve that system, absolutely. But what we've seen in some other states is it actually costs more to implement the work requirements and all the monitoring than it does to provide the benefits. So there's no reason that we should be putting more money on taxpayers to try to kick people off health insurance when we've seen great results in the state.
Now, the ballot measure, of course, that failed had a tobacco tax and was rejected by voters. You're coming back with a tobacco tax? Seriously?
I think that at the end of the day, that Montanans, with that ballot initiative, they weren't voting against a tobacco tax and they weren't voting against a sunset on Medicaid. What we saw is more money thrown in by the out-of-state tobacco companies and was even spent in the governor's race in 2016. So they clouded up things quite a bit. I think everybody ought to be doing their own part to make sure we continue this program. And given that all Montanans end up paying for tobacco-related illnesses, for tobacco to have some skin in the game only makes sense.
We'll find out soon if that's a persuasive argument. That also leads us to our next big topic, the governor's budget, state spending, and taxes. Governor Bullock is proposing a fairly modest increase in state spending, about 7% over 2 years, in a $10.3 billion budget. Highlights include a $290 million infrastructure plan, some additional economic development tools, and significant proposals for education, state funding for preschool, need-based aid for Montana students attending state colleges and universities, and freezing college tuition. But he's also proposing some new taxes, almost $80 million a year, to help pay for it all. Most of that is in higher tobacco taxes, but he would also raise taxes or fees on lodging, liquor, rental cars, and investment advisors. The leaders of the Republican majority at the legislature say they don't think those tax increases will get very far.
I don't think the Republicans are inclined to vote for any tax increases to grow government more. That's not a new plan. That's something that we've tried to live within our means on an ongoing basis, and I think that's what we're going to do again. So we're going to have a budget that reflects the revenue that's currently coming in, and we don't have an appetite to pass any taxes. And I feel very confident in saying that because I've talked to, I should say, the more moderate members of our caucus as well as the conservatives, and we're in consensus on that.
The governor, he has proposed of almost $160 million in new taxes. That'll be a non-starter at the legislature, so we will not be looking at any new taxes going through the session.
So no taxes whatsoever? There isn't anything for which you might consider a tax if you decided you wanted to fund it?
Well, there's always a possibility, but right now I think we look at our revenue projections, and our revenue projections look good, that they can cover our budget going forward and the rate of inflation and mandatory increases that we need to make.
Democratic Senate Minority Leader John Sesso of Butte says he hopes that Republicans aren't saying no to everything and are open to a discussion about whether certain tax increases make sense.
There are certain of these taxes that are, the consumers are being taxed at, 1970 and 1980 prices. And we're missing opportunities to implement those taxes. For example, this tax on insurance brokers, or stockbrokers. I mean, it's been in place since 1973 or 74. We're suggesting a modest increase in what they're paying to be licensed to sell stocks and equities here in Montana. I mean, it's a $14 million bill. I mean, and it's something that in my interviews with the stockbrokers that I know in Butte and elsewhere, it's fine. We're paying far more in other states. We'd like to help Montana out. Every dollar we get in a reasonable increase in user fees or these types of taxes might be a dollar that we can use to beef up our rainy day fund, pay for that next fire if the 19 season is as drastic as 17 was. We can build our resources and then make good decisions. I'm sure there's probably a wad of tax bills down there to reduce taxes. Well, you can't reduce taxes in areas where you think tax relief is warranted unless we're taking advantage of taxes in areas where it's common practice.
The governor also says the discussion should be about what the additional money will pay for and whether Montanans support that spending.
One of the first things that, in laying out the budget, I said, let's make sure that we leave enough cushion at the end so we're not bringing legislators back to hell on it, or we're not cutting programs that Montanans expect. I want to have a responsible ending fund balance or reserve, just so we don't get into what happened last time. Recognize what happened from not just state agencies being cut, though we had to close offices all around the state, but services that Montanans expect ended up having to be cut. And I think that Montanans want a little bit more responsibility. So at the end of the day, we have proposed some responsible revenue increases, some of which I think that we'll have the representatives for them coming in with us saying, no, it makes sense, because we need to make sure we're funding the government that Montanans expect.
When it comes to generating tax revenue, Republicans say they'd rather take actions that help the private sector, such as boosting natural resource industries like mining.
We'd like to also see, revenue generated in the private sector, and we think that that can be accomplished through additional mining projects. There's 3 of them that are on the map right now that survived this one I-186 initiative, and we're hoping that the governor will help expedite those projects because they employ people at a level that really complements the economy. Those are like $80,000 jobs. People can pay for their own health care, and typically they come with health care too.
Bullock says he'd have to see the details of the legislation that Republicans have in mind in this area before deciding whether it's something he can support. When it comes to his budget and plans for the future, after Medicaid expansion, the top of the governor's wish list includes his education proposals for preschool funding, a college tuition freeze, and need-based aids for Montana students.
Montana was one of only 6 states that hadn't made any state investment in publicly funded preschool and a voluntary program until last legislative session. I'm hopeful that we'll build off of the successes and do what 44 other states have already done and said that this is an investment that we can't afford not to be making for the state. I mean, it's important to me because we know that 90% of a child's brain is developed before they even enter kindergarten. If you're not kindergarten ready, half as likely to be reading at grade level by 3rd grade. If you're not reading at grade level by 3rd grade, 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. Chambers of commerce and business people around the country have actually been taking the lead on this, saying that it's time legislators stop thinking in 2-year increments. They need workforce. And making sure that you have the soft skills and you're kindergarten ready not only impacts that individual child, not only impacts the parent who then can be at work, but it also impacts the kids, the rest of the kids in the classroom so that the teacher can better spread out his or her time. I mean, there's a reason why there's been statistical analysis, long-term analysis, that for every buck you put in, there's a $7 return to your community. There's a reason why every other state has been making these investments, and that's often in very conservative states.
Now in higher ed, of course, you've proposed freezing tuition.
Every time you increase tuition, it's essentially a tax on up to 40,000 working families in our state. I'm pleased that we've been able to keep tuition low. We're also proposing need-based aid, which Montana is probably the only state that's putting no state dollars into need-based aid. When you talk to business communities, when you talk to others, investing in higher ed is so important. That's not just our 4-year colleges. I'm pleased with what we've been able to do to date in my administration with 2-year colleges, and we'll continue to emphasize them as well.
Republican leaders aren't jumping on board with the Bullock education proposals just yet, but the incoming House Speaker says the GOP may have some education proposals of its own with an eye toward developing Montana's workforce.
Also in education, we'll make sure we put the students of Montana first, whether it's K through 12, and maybe help some pre-K students, along with kids after they graduate from high school. to make sure they have the right path forward to jobs in Montana.
Democrats also are making yet another push for a wide-ranging infrastructure spending plan, financed at least in part by state debt.
I think the infrastructure piece is just as important this time as it's been in the past. We've got cities and towns that are screaming for help relative to water and sewer systems. The water and sewer piece, public drinking water, sewerage going into our Montana streams, those are projects that got to get done. And I feel like the infrastructure that needs to get invested in. Of course, as you know, I have been long a proponent of bonding and using dollars today for things that will only be more expensive in the future. And so I am I'm hoping that there's a more receptive environment here in the legislature to invest in our future, really make infrastructure investments rather than getting all caught up in bonding is borrowing and we're borrowing against our kids' future. No, what we're doing is investing in our children and grandchildren's future, and that's what our forefathers and our parents did. That's what we got to do for future generations.
I have listened to legislators as they've said, well, it seems like more of this money's going into buildings than it is into our rural communities. And you look at this $300 million proposal, more of it is actually going into local communities in rural areas than it is into buildings. But I think when we look at the need to invest today for long term, certainly that includes water, sewer, bridges, broadband, but it also includes our buildings and our educational institutions. But every home, every local government actually invests in infrastructure through bonding. We haven't been doing that lately. I hope that this is a much more balanced proposal, that any rural legislator can't be turned around and saying, oh, all the money goes to Bozeman, when more of the money is going into their communities.
Why would the result be any different than has been in prior legislatures? The same old projects get jettisoned, separated out, or rejected, or go down to the last minute and they get kicked aside. Yeah. What's different this time?
It's different in as much as that, when you look at the overall package, there is actually more. I mean, we have north of $40 million fund just going to communities that were impacted by oil and gas or coal, and that's increases or decreases. That's money going right out into these communities. I think at some point, our state legislature has to take a look at how every other government funds long-term infrastructure programs. I'm hopeful that this is one and a proposal that they'll take that close look at and say, let's move it forward.
So it looks like we'll see some tension between what people would like to fund and how much money is available. The state isn't in a budget crunch, but it's not rolling in dough either.
Actually, this session, you can look at it a couple different ways. It's nice that we're not going to be having to, look underneath the cushions in the couch for spare change and rob and Peter to pay Paul to make ends meet. Maybe this session's going to be just like the Three Bears. This porridge is just right. We got enough revenue to continue what we're currently doing, but we don't have a lot to expand government, which myself and a lot of the more conservative Republicans are opposed to seeing government with an ever increasing budget and an ever increasing amount of responsibility. So we'll see, but it isn't all bad when you have a little less money, because then you take a much more jaunt aside of what you're currently doing and making sure that what you're spending your money on, you're getting a decent return. And oftentimes when you have a lot of money, it's just really easy to play Santa Claus. And I don't think that's productive for the citizens of Montana, and I think it makes for bad government.
We've talked a lot about the money issues. Now we turn to something different. Drugs, both illegal and legal. Montana is grappling with opioid addiction, in particular methamphetamine.
There's been a lot of attention paid to this opioid crisis. I think it's critical that we do whatever we can. Now, I'll say that it's not my view that we can just make criminals out of people who are addicted. This is another addiction that comes with treatment, it comes with community-based programs, and we've got to make sure we make our investments in the right spot, but we got to do something about that.
Methamphetamine is a huge problem across this state. And I've worked and I've talked already with the AG's office. They have several proposals that they want to bring forward that will help maybe stop this meth epidemic that we have across the state. Plus, we also need to look at addiction treatment centers too, so we can help these individuals to get off this terrible drug and move in the right direction.
Attorney General Tim Fox says his office will bring several proposals to this legislature to combat illegal drugs, including approaches that emphasize treatment and prevention.
I think we have a societal bias that for many years has suggested that someone with a substance use disorder is a second-class citizen, they're a criminal, and for whatever reason they're not worthy of our help or support. And we want to debunk that myth as well, that these are our neighbors, our kids, could be our parents, could be anybody. None of us are immune from getting into a substance use disorder or a co-occurring mental health disorder as well. We've learned through the work we've done the last few years that our specialty courts, our drug courts, family courts, veterans courts, and others that we have in some jurisdictions have been very useful and very effective in intervening in the lives of people with substance use disorders early so that they can get the help they need and be held accountable. But the problem is that they're not adequately funded, and the state doesn't provide funding at all. So we want to make sure that there's adequate funding, not just for the existing specialty courts, but also to expand those courts so that more Montana citizens have that option and not going to jail, but yet getting interdisciplinary teams to work with them and hold them accountable. We've also learned that prevention and education to keep people out of getting into substance use disorders in the first place is key. Currently, Montana doesn't spend any money through our state budget on those things. A lot of good folks are doing a lot of things. We believe that it needs to be more focused and better funded, and so we're looking at ways of funding that as well. There are certain ways that we might be able to do that without raising taxes, but certainly, the distributors and the manufacturers of these drugs have to have some skin in the game. So we may look possibly at some sort of a tax levied on these opioid-based drugs to either fund treatment courts or to fund prevention education efforts, or both.
Fox says he'll also have proposals to crack down on the abuse of prescription drugs, such as opioid painkillers.
We now understand that really for most medical professionals, the standard of care is to use the prescription drug registry to stop people from doctor shopping and getting prescription drugs from multiple sources. Right now, our prescription drug registry is voluntary, and we believe that if all prescribers and pharmacies were using it, that we could make a dent in the opioid-based prescription drug problem. We also feel that e-scripts or e-prescribing is an important tool, because with these antiquated written scripts, you can forge them, you can steal them, you can alter them, and so if we go to an e-script solution, we believe that'll help from stop some of the diversion. We're also suggesting that there be a limit on certain first-time opioid-based prescriptions. We know from the science that the larger number of pills that someone is prescribed, the more apt they are to become addicted. And in many cases, there's just no reason to give someone a 30, 60, or 90-day supply of something like OxyContin.
And finally, we're going to see some proposals not to crack down on the use of prescription drugs, but rather the high price of those drugs. State Auditor Matt Rosendale, whose office regulates health insurers, will be bringing forth a bill to force drug companies to reveal more information about their pricing and less expensive alternatives.
And what we have is Big Pharma, who has been taking advantage of the consumers and the businesses, quite frankly, of Montana, and using fancy terms like spread pricing and rebates that sound like they're benefiting the consumer, when in reality it boils down to those terms are price gouging and kickbacks for the industry. And we have been trying very hard to get the information to identify where these dollars are all going, to the point that we had to take legal action against these big pharma companies that were functioning here in Montana. Finally, we're able to get the information, and now we're going to bring legislation forward that is going to help drive down the cost of pharmaceuticals for the consumers and bring transparency to the pharmacists that are delivering it. Because these folks, not only were they charging a lot of money and driving the cost of health care up, but they were also hurting our independent pharmacies when they were not allowed to share information with their customers. We're going to be able to use the current statute and utilize the insurers, the insurance companies, and their relationships with these big pharma companies to make sure that we're able to shed light on this problem and extract the monies that they are keeping. These are multi-billion-dollar corporations, and make sure that our consumers, Montana consumers, are going to start getting the benefit of some of those funds. We are completely prepared, I will tell you. Again, they're multi-billion-dollar corporations that they're going to have an army of very well-paid lobbyists there in Helena for the legislative session to try and fight us. But I think that the legislators and the consumers of Montana will not be fooled by a bunch of smooth-talking, high-paid lobbyists, and we're going to be able to get this legislation through. And I really believe that the governor is going to join with us and sign it.
Those are the big issues. But no discussion of the session would be complete without taking a look at the politics as well. Governor Bullock, of course, is a Democrat. Republicans control majorities in both houses. But there's also a group of moderate Republicans who could form a swing bloc of voters on key issues. We asked Governor Bullock and legislative leaders how that might figure into the equation.
It's a little cumbersome, it's a little difficult, but I think if people have been paying attention to the legislature over the last several years, we had a pretty fractured caucus in 13. 15 was better, but more similar to the 13 session, and then the Senate leadership decided to take a little bit different track last time, and I thought it benefited us. We worked together a lot better. There wasn't divisiveness like there was inside the caucus and on the House, or I should say Senate floor, that existed, especially in the 13 session. So I think we've made some progress in that area. We're going to continue to work. Republicans, we agree on more than we disagree. Our caucus is very independent. That's why I believe it's one of our greatest strengths, but it's also a knife that cuts both ways. So it's something that you have to be aware of.
I'll take the same approach that I've always taken, and I hope that the legislators come to Helena in January saying that Montanans expect us to get things done and work together. Always more than happy to try to meet folks halfway. I hope they'll do the same. So I walk in as optimistic as I've been every legislative session. I'm optimistic that the legislators that will come will be here to do what their constituents expect, and that's actually to work together, get things done, continue to build on an economy that's doing pretty darn well, continue to invest in education, health care, and get some good stuff done.
That's our show for today. I'm Mike Dennison, MTN's Chief Political Reporter. We'll be bringing you full coverage of the session starting next week. Thanks for joining us on Face the State.
You've been watching Face the State, a presentation of MTN, the Montana Television Network.